Before skyscrapers and bright lights, New York was a port built on human bondage. Tonight, we step into that forgotten world. Welcome to Robert's History. I'm Robert, and I'm grateful you're here. If you value honest storytelling about the past, please consider subscribing so we can continue this journey together. Some visuals in this video are symbolic and may not perfectly match every detail, and I appreciate your understanding. Now, take a breath, settle in, and I hope this story brings you reflection, nostalgia, and a quiet moment of connection with history. If you had walked through New York in the 1750s, you would not have seen the skyline we know today. There were no steel towers, no electric lights, no roaring avenues. Instead, you would have found a growing port town of wooden houses, church steeples, muddy streets, and crowded docks along the East River. Ships arrived constantly, carrying goods, news, and human cargo. Trade was expanding, wealth was rising. From the outside, it looked like a place of opportunity. But that prosperity rested on a system many people today do not associate with New York. By the mid-18th century, the city had one of the highest proportions of slave-holding households in the northern colonies. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were woven into daily life. They built ships, hauled cargo, worked workshops, cooked meals, and maintained homes. Their labor powered the harbor economy that allowed merchants and property owners to thrive. This was not a distant southern plantation world, it was Manhattan. The foundations of streets many of us have walked were laid in a society structured by racial hierarchy and human bondage. To understand New York in the 1750s is to recognize that its early growth and confidence were inseparable from slavery. That uncomfortable truth sets the stage for everything that follows. For the enslaved men, women, and children living in New York in the 1750s, daily life revolved around labor that sustained the entire city. If you stood near the docks along the East River, you would have seen black men hauling barrels, loading ships, repairing hulls, and working as shipbuilders and carpenters. Others labored as blacksmiths, coopers, carters, and general port workers. Their strength powered the maritime trade that made New York prosperous. Without their work, the harbor economy would have stalled. Inside homes, enslaved women and men carried out domestic service that was just as essential. They cooked meals, cleaned rooms, washed clothes, tended fires, and cared for children. In wealthier households, their presence was also a visible symbol of status. Owning enslaved people signaled rank and financial success. Yet the people performing this labor were not recognized as workers with rights. Under colonial law, they were classified as chattel, legally treated as property that could be bought, sold, inherited, or used as collateral. Living conditions reflected that status. Many enslaved people in the city slept in kitchens, attics, cellars, or small outbuildings behind their owners' homes. Space was cramped, and privacy was almost non-existent. Diets were simple and limited, often based on cornmeal, bread, or porridge, sometimes supplemented by scraps. Sanitation in 18th century cities was poor for everyone, but those at the bottom of the social order had the least protection from disease and cold. Physical hardship shaped each day. Work began early and ended late. Injuries were common in dock labor and skilled trades, yet medical care depended entirely on an owner's willingness to provide it. There was no legal protection from overwork or abuse. At the same time, movement was restricted and literacy was often forbidden, limiting opportunities for communication or advancement. When we picture colonial New York, it is easy to imagine merchants and meeting houses. It is harder, but necessary, to picture the hands that carried the weight of that world. The control of enslaved people in 1750s New York did not rely on custom alone. It was written into law. Colonial authorities created a legal structure designed to monitor, restrict, and punish. These laws were not hidden. They were public, deliberate, and enforced. One of the most significant measures was the 1730 slave law, which prohibited more than 3 enslaved people from gathering together unless they had explicit permission from their owner. In a dense port city where information could travel quickly, lawmakers feared communication as much as rebellion. Violating this restriction could result in up to 40 lashes on a bare back. Public whipping was not only punishment but spectacle. It reinforced hierarchy before the eyes of the community. Earlier legislation had already established the ultimate penalty. A 1708 law mandated death for any enslaved person who killed or attempted to kill their master. After periods of unrest earlier in the century, authorities made clear that lethal resistance would be met with execution. The legal code treated enslaved people as property. Yet, when accused of serious crimes, they faced the full weight of criminal law without equal protection. Brutality functioned as deterrence. The purpose was not simply to punish individuals, but to send a warning. Law, violence, and public display worked together to preserve order in a society built on forced labor. When we look back, it becomes clear that slavery in New York was sustained not only by economics, but by an organized system of fear backed by statute. In 1741, a series of fires in New York sparked what officials believed was a vast slave conspiracy. Fear spread quickly through the city. Rumors of planned uprisings moved from taverns to courtrooms, and suspicion fell heavily on enslaved Africans and poor whites. What followed was a wave of mass hysteria. More than 100 people were arrested. Dozens were executed, some by hanging and others by being burned at the stake. Confessions were often extracted under pressure, and the trials reflected the anxieties of the moment more than clear evidence. Even though historians still debate the extent of any organized plot, the psychological impact on white New Yorkers was immediate and lasting. The events of 1741 hardened attitudes and deepened mistrust. Authorities interpreted ordinary gatherings, conversations, and movements as potential threats. The legal restrictions already in place gained renewed urgency. By 1755, officials conducted detailed slave censuses in parts of the colony, not simply to count population, but to identify individuals they considered troublesome or influential. The goal was surveillance as much as record-keeping. A culture of paranoia took root. For the white population, security meant tighter control. For the black community, everyday life unfolded under even closer scrutiny. The memory of 1741 lingered in the background, shaping decisions long after the fires had burned out. Despite the fear that followed 1741, the buying and selling of enslaved people in New York did not come to a halt. In fact, the trade continued in full public view. A formal slave market operated at the foot of Wall Street along the East River, first established in 1711 and active for decades afterward. Auctions were also held at places like the Meal Market and the Fly Market. Human beings were inspected, priced, and sold in the same commercial spaces where other goods were exchanged. In 1753, colonial authorities were still regulating the importation of enslaved Africans, setting fees on those brought directly from Africa who were over a certain age. That detail matters. It shows that more than a decade after the alleged conspiracy, the government was not retreating from slavery. It was managing it as part of normal economic policy. This is the uncomfortable paradox. Public fear did not translate into abolition or even meaningful restriction. Instead, anxiety produced tighter control over the people already enslaved, while the market itself remained intact. Merchants, ship owners, and property holders had strong financial incentives to maintain the system. For them, enslaved labor meant profit and growth. When we think of Wall Street today, we often picture finance and global markets. In the 18th century, part of that financial foundation rested on the commodification of human lives. Fear reshaped surveillance, but it did not dismantle the economy that depended on bondage. Even within a system designed to control every movement, enslaved people in New York found ways to assert agency. Their resistance was not always loud or visible, but it was real. In kitchens, workshops, and along the docks, they built quiet networks of support. Information traveled by word of mouth. Spiritual practices and cultural traditions were preserved in private spaces. Community formed even under surveillance. Some individuals experienced what was known as half-freedom, a status granted earlier in the Dutch period to certain Africans who had served the colony. These men and women could live on designated land north of the city and farm for themselves, though they still owed labor or payments, and their children did not always inherit the same status. Even so, this fragile autonomy shows that freedom was imagined and negotiated long before formal emancipation. Others hired out their own labor with an owner's permission, earning small sums that in rare cases could be saved toward purchasing manumission. And throughout the century, some chose the most dangerous path of all and attempted escape, seeking freedom in other colonies or rural areas. When we look back, it is important to remember not only oppression but persistence. Enslaved New Yorkers were not passive figures in someone else's story. They navigated constraint with courage, holding on to dignity and hope in ways that shaped the city's future in quiet but lasting ways. The legacy of slavery in 18th century New York is not abstract, it is physical. In the 1990s, construction in Lower Manhattan uncovered what is now known as the African Burial Ground, a site containing the remains of thousands of enslaved and free Africans who lived in the colonial city. For generations, their presence had been largely forgotten beneath layers of urban growth. The rediscovery forced the city to confront a deeper foundation beneath its streets. That burial ground reminds us that early New York was not shaped by merchants alone, but by men and women whose labor was coerced and whose names were often erased from official records. The institutions that grew in the 18th century, from churches to commercial networks, developed within a structure that normalized bondage and racial hierarchy. For those of us who think of New York as a symbol of opportunity, this history complicates the story. Prosperity and injustice developed side by side. Acknowledging that truth does not diminish the city's achievements, it makes them more honest. When we walk through Lower Manhattan today, we are moving through layers of memory. The stones and streets carry stories of resilience as well as ambition, and remembering both is part of understanding where the city truly began. As I reflect on this history, I believe we owe it honesty and compassion. New York's story is inspiring, but it is also complicated, and I feel it deserves to be told in full. I would truly like to hear your thoughts, so please share them in the comments and let us learn from one another. If this video meant something to you, subscribe to Robert's History and join me for the next chapter. Thank you for spending this time with me.